Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another Supatease video. And in this one, I am going to be constructing a tier list of what I would consider to be the most difficult ranged specializations to play in Shadowlands. In the previous video, you may have seen for melee DPS, the easiest one. I decided maybe it made more sense to do it the opposite direction, the hardest ones. So what I would consider the most mechanically demanding are going to be going in onto the S tier, and then of course the least mechanically demanding going down into the D tier. And I have to say, out of all of the tier lists, unironically, this was the most difficult one to make, because as playing a ranged DPS in World of Warcraft, rotationally in PvP, things become very difficult. Do note that most of this is going to be oriented towards PvP, as I think the difficulty and the mechanics of the class are increased, or there's put more demand on in PvP than there is in PvE. Now, rotationally, while that is going to be taken into consideration, that would be applicable to PvE, but a lot of other things like avoiding interrupts or even landing interrupts, I think, or landing crowd control, avoiding crowd control, these are things that are more prevalent in PvP and are probably going to be more in demand, specifically for the specializations talking about the game. So just to get that out of the way right away. And why I say it was the hardest was because I had a tough time deciding, because if you play one of these specializations, you probably think that everything else is easy and your spec is hard. And then I was thinking, am I going to apply that same type of bias? I wanted to ask a couple people what they thought. And then I also thought, there's no way that they can all be equally difficult, right? Is it possible? So let's break it down into a couple of categories, right? So Affliction Warlock as the first one up, just because this is the way that the tier list has unfolded. What is difficult about Affliction Warlock? Well, you're going to be global cooldown capped, which means that you need to be pressing a button at all times, and if you don't press them optimally, you are falling behind in terms of your overall potential output. Now, it's a very high demand mechanically. In PvE or PvP. And in PvP, you have the added, what do you say, restriction of needing to avoid damage, as you're usually a very high priority target. So you need to know how to kite, and that just means avoid damage. You have a lot of tools to do this, whether it be crowd controlling enemies with fear, or using your mobility with Demonic Circle Baseline and Demonic Gateway. You need to land interrupts with Spell Lock. You need to determine whether or not it needs to be used on a healer to stop an incoming heal, or used on a damage dealer to stop damage, or used to stop crowd control. This is something to take in consideration that you're going to have to be monitoring at all times. Another addition to Shadowlands Affliction Warlock is Fell Domination, which a lot of people are probably thinking like, oh, you're going to use that to save your pet when it dies. I think more often than not, you're probably going to be using Fell Domination to summon in another Fell Hunter to get a second counter spell, much like you used to be able to, and it was removed. You can currently utilize Fell Domination in this fashion, which gives you then a second line of thinking towards how you want to use that interrupt. So you need to be maintaining a global cooldown capped rotation, trying to avoid death with mobility and crowd control at all times, secure interrupts both offensively and defensively. I mean, this is already just like pretty demanding. But once you've got it under control, is it easy, right? This is where, like, coming into, if I play an Affliction Warlock, am I going to say what I'm doing is harder than everybody else? I feel like if you're out there and you're a new player and you're using this as a list of like, what should I play based on, I just want something I can get into and play and have some success with without putting too much effort into practicing, then I think that Affliction might not be a spec that you would want to go after. This is a spec that has very demanding mechanically. It's an intense specialization to play. In the hands of a phenomenal player, this thing is going to be insane, and it's going to feel really great. So do we put it into the S tier for most difficult specialization? I think you have to. Just reviewing everything that we've said here, I feel like Affliction has to be going into the S tier category. Demanding complicated rotation, crowd control, kiting, fragile, rewards casting, needs to avoid interrupts. I feel like there's no way that we can't say Affliction Warlock is a highly mechanically demanding specialization. However, will be highly rewarding if you want to invest your time into learning and mastering the specialization. Now, Arcane Mage, the next specialization here, its rotation I think is a lot simpler than Affliction. At the moment, it's just spamming arcane missiles, so doing damage not as difficult as Affliction. However, landing crowd control I think is a lot more important as an Arcane Mage. So being able to get polymorphs on healers, being able to save your teammates when required. Maybe it's about the same as Affliction with spam fear and spam polymorph. If anything, maybe it's a bit easier because you can blink in, whereas Affliction Warlock getting to the healer to crowd control them on top of maximizing their damage is actually much harder to do. So Arcane Mage is not more mechanically demanding than Affliction, definitely damage-wise. Landing setups and burst moments, because that's a requirement of the specialization, as opposed to Affliction, I could see that making it more difficult. I wouldn't say that it's as difficult as Affliction. In PvE, for example, its rotation is very simple, and it's just about managing your mana. So I think it holds it back from being Affliction level, but in PvP, you still need to kite, use Blink, Frost Nova, Polymorph. You need to utilize your entire kit to really have success with it. So I don't think that it's obviously basement floor level, and I don't think I could say that about any of the mage specializations. But for me personally, I think for Arcane, it's about in PvE, I think it's a much easier kind of like pick up and play. But when you incorporate needing to land crowd control, coordinating your burst damage in PvP, then the spec becomes a lot more complicated. So just take that into account if you're more interested in PvE. I think that it is one of the easier specializations. It's PvP that's really bumping up the difficulty of the specialization a lot. Beast Mastery Hunter. I'm sorry, that was easy. I mean, Beast Mastery Hunter, for me, it's pretty straightforward. Smash all your damage buttons, maintain your barbed shot stack, and land a trap every time it's off cooldown on a stun target on the healer. I don't think that it is overly complicated. I do think this is a specialization that's just a feels good spec where it's not going to take you very much to get into it. You just log on, slap your keybinds, try to land trap on the healer every 30 seconds. Your interrupt is almost non-consequential because it's only a 2-second duration. So, if you miss it, you don't want to miss it, but it's not as rewarding or punishing if you miss or land it compared to a spell lock or a counter spell from a mage or a warlock. Your crowd control is easier to land. Your damage is unpreventable. The only real downside is your pet dying, but I don't know if that necessarily makes it hard to play. It just, I don't think the pet should be as easy as it is to kill or as hard as it is to res. So I'm really not taking that into consideration for the difficulty of Beast Mastery Hunter. But I should maybe explain myself before I slap it down on the lowest tier. To me, again, it's not meant to be insulting if your spec ends up being in the D tier in this specific list, but this is more or less constructed for players to know, all right, is this a spec that I want to invest and learn over time and master, or is this a spec that I just want to log in, kind of feel good, play, press my buttons, and get a couple kills or something like that. I think BM Hunter fits into that second part pretty well, if not the most well of all the specializations for ranged. So that's why it's going down in the D tier. Balanced Druid, you don't have the interrupt management as Affliction and Arcane, or as Warlocks and Mages or Shamans, right? Because your interrupt is a 1-minute cooldown. So your main priority oftentimes with that is it's just a blanket crowd control every minute. All you've got to think about it is I'm solar beaming the healer every minute with mass entanglement. Sometimes you may want to allocate it otherwise, so you do need to make that decision, but you're not making it as frequently as something like a Shaman with wind shear every 12 seconds. So your impact in it can matter, but because it's such a longer cooldown, you can more or less get away with just sort of like putting in the back of your mind, using your interrupt on the healer every minute. Your damage is in PvP is basically instant cast. I don't think that it's that challenging to get off. Maintain your dots, generate astral power. The reworked Eclipse system, while important to maximize in PvE, I have noticed I can pretty much ignore in PvP as the casted spells aren't really relevant. If the Eclipse system was more necessary to being able to win as the Balanced Druid and not all of your damage being in Star Surge, then it would be more mechanically demanding. You do have Cyclone, like Affliction or like Warlock and Mage for crowd control, so you need to be able to land that on the healer. You need to be able to land that on a DPS to save your partners. It's a bit easier to survive when you're the target because you can go into bear form, tank the enemies. You can always shapeshift out of slows and kite. You're highly mobile. in this regard. So I think it is easier to survive than a mage or a warlock as a balanced druid. The damage is easier to do. The crowd control is more or less sort of automated. You're just thinking every minute, solar beam the healer. In PvE, I think it is a much more complicated spec than where I'm about to put it currently on the tier list. And this is why I didn't want to be biased, right? Because I played a lot of balanced druid. I didn't want to be biased with this list. So when I'm giving this out as feedback, I think in PvE it's a lot more complicated than where I'm about to put it. But I'm including PvP, and if we include the game as a whole, then I think that that's a better ranking of the spec overall. So for me, I think it's more of a B tier. The damage is pretty easy to pull off. Survivability is fairly easy. Crowd control is more or less kind of scripted, so you don't think about it. It's just, this is your game plan every minute, and it's instant cast. But needing to cyclone targets does introduce a little bit of complexity in terms of when you need to time aggressive crowd control versus defensive crowd control. And I don't think that it's going to be as challenging as a mage or a warlock to immediately pick up. But it's not going to have the same overall payout likely. It could still do well, but I think it's more fair to put it in the middle. In PvE, I think it is more complicated, though, than something like Arcane Mage, if this was purely based off PvE. Demonology, this might be the only time that Demonology is going to be S tier on a list when it comes to a spec in Shadowlands. I mean, this is a spec that's been on the bottom for a long time, and I mean, I think that it is harder to play than Affliction. I almost kind of want to put it above Affliction. It's a spec that is incredibly demanding, has a ton of keybinds, a ton of utility, and requires a ton of ramp and knowledge of the specialization to really make it perform. And make it perform is maybe not just doing it justice, because in reality, it's to make it even remotely work. Requires a huge demand. So if you want a spec that is, in my mind, one of the hardest specs to play, it's got all the same mechanically demanding factors that Affliction has. I said maintaining your pet balance and buffing them with Demonic Tyrant as opposed to dots, managing your interrupts and your stuns. It's as challenging as Affliction, and the payout is lower. It's like you're both working the same grueling job that it's intense all the time. You're like an air traffic control person trying to fly airplanes in, and you're both doing that. But as Demonology, you're paid $5 an hour, and then Affliction, you paid $500 an hour. You know, they're both going to be really demanding, but the payout for one is just not comparable to the other. But it doesn't mean that Demonology isn't mechanically demanding. I've actually heard a lot of opinions that they think Demonology is one of the most fun specs in the game, but in PvP, to actually pull off wins is going to be really hard. So if you want to take on the challenge of that, an incredibly demanding, intense spec that doesn't pay well, then Demonology is probably going to be your go-to. And I think that it is equally challenging in PvE as PvP in terms of its overall rotation. Destruction, I think this is a much simpler specialization than Affliction or Demonology. Even just rotationally, generate soul shards, spend soul shards, single target chaos bolt, AoE, rain of fire. I think that is much more pick up and play in terms of a specialization when it comes to warlock specifically. You still do need to focus on landing interrupts and landing fear, but oftentimes you can just overrun the target with lots of cooldown damage. I think in PvE, it's also one of the more streamlined specializations, kind of pick up and play and have a good time when it comes to things like dungeons. Overall, I think it is actually easier to play than Balanced Druid. So for me, I'm putting Destruction on the C tier. And another reason is because if you're interrupted, you have a lot of other abilities that you can cast. Whereas for other specializations, if you get interrupted on Cyclone, you can't heal. If Cyclone is stopped, then everything is shut down. If you're a Warlock, you get kicked on Fear, you Chaos Bolt somebody. Whereas Affliction, Arcane, Demonology can't do that. So I think of Destruction is more forgiving, more straightforward initially when you get into it, and its payout is high when it comes to PvE, definitely, and as well as PvP. So in terms of its overall difficulty and mechanically demanding, it carries over some things with interrupts. I don't think it's a BM Hunter. Maybe if there was like a C+, I'd put it slightly further above BM Hunter, but I think this is a good spec to just kind of like pick up and play if you're worried about being challenged too much by the game and you want something that's a little bit more straightforward. I think Destruction is definitely that. Now, Elemental had some interesting intricacies with legendaries, but then those legendaries got reworked into just kind of just like, yeah, you get flat increased damage. The elementalist kind of like bouncing between different schools of magic and trying to time them in a cool order was nice mechanically in terms of its rotation, but they removed that. And I think they removed a pretty big level of complexity to it. It's a specialization that, because it has things like Grounding Totem in PvP and Wind Shear in PvE or PvP, you're like always in demand for landing interrupts, and you need to be paying attention to everything that's being casted all the time, because you could be min-maxing Wind Shear at all times. I think that is mechanically demanding. That's going to require high awareness per minute. This is the same thing as APM. You really need to be aware of everything that's happening, even more so than mages or warlocks, because of the low cooldown. Damage wise in PvP, it's pretty simple. Just keep Flame Shock up as many things as possible, press Lava Burst, and use Stormkeeper. I don't think dealing damage in PvP is really challenging as Elemental, kind of much like Balanced Druid. In PvE, it is a lot more, but it's still kind of just builder spender, much like Destruction Warlock. Press Chain Lightning AoE, press Lightning Bolt single target, build, spend on Earthshock single target, spend on Earthquake AoE. I think it is more straightforward and not super mechanically demanding. And because it has multiple schools of magic, frost, nature, fire, you're much more difficult to shut down. And in PvP, you have a lot more instant cast damage as well. So I think because of the interrupt in the grounding, where do we put this? I ran through this already and I've done this list multiple times, and that's why I said it was the hardest one to make. For me, Elemental Shaman, no, there isn't spammable crowd control. So you do sometimes defensively need to be aware of that. You get the hybrid role of needing to heal your allies in PvP. and PvE, you can pretty much ignore that. In PvE, I think it is more straightforward. So if something that you're worried about in dungeons, it's just keep dots up, build resource, spend resource. Whether it's single target or AoE is dependent on if you're attacking single target or AoE. I think it is more straightforward, less mechanically demanding in PvE specifically. In PvP, it's the interrupts, right? And the grounding totems that really step up what's required. I feel like that puts it on par with Balanced Druid, probably. I think it's a spec that you can pick up and play in PvE, and it'll be much like Destruction Warlock if this was purely a PvE list. But because PvP is also included, I think the demand of finding all of these interrupts at all times and denying crowd control and knocking enemies away does add a layer of it. But it's easier than Mage or Warlock because of the way it does damage specifically. So it falls about in the middle. If you wanted to pick this up as a new player, I think it would be great, and it still has room to improve and master, which is excellent. Fire Mage, I don't think in PvP, lining up your fire blasts, timing your combustion windows is actually very challenging, but also very rewarding. It's the same in PvP. And now with Greater Pyroblast effectively removed on a 15-second cooldown, the kind of like fire mages that were just sitting there pressing one button over and over and over is kind of gone, where I would have put fire mage less mechanically demanding with that previous iteration of it. But now, having to spread your damage with Phoenix Flames, I think there is a little bit more nuance. It's still just the Fire Blast combustion, sort of combust, power down Fire Mage that you're expecting. If not, maybe a little bit more disjointed than the Battle for Azeroth version of it, if you just want like an overall opinion of the Fire Mage. I think much like, I wouldn't say that it is as challenging as the Warlock specializations, because they can do everything the Mage does while trying to min-max their global cooldowns at all times and line up burst windows, right? Like that's everything. Whereas this is much more find your moment, know what that moment is, which is mechanically demanding. That's whether or not it's PvE or PvP. And then outside of that, it's more or less either in PvP, it doesn't matter what you're doing, or in PvE, just spamming Fireball, fishing for procs. So the rotation doesn't become as complex in those categories. Unlike Arcane, where if Arcane gets interrupted in PvP, you can't do anything. So getting interrupted is devastating. As Fire, if you get interrupted, you can still do a lot of other things because you've got Arcane School, Fire, and Frost School to cast from. So this is where things really start becoming difficult, is when I brought the mages in. Is Mage... Are you going to be able to immediately start having success like I believe you would have on a BM Hunter or a Destruction or a Balancer or an Elemental on a Fire Mage? If you don't know the cooldown timings, probably not. It's very much one trick wonder with combustion. And if you don't know how it works, you're not going to have a good time. But as soon as you know how it works, it is. You still have counterspell on a reasonably low cooldown interrupt to prioritize offensively, defensively. You do still need to land crowd control on the healer and then coordinate damage with all those other previous things stated to be able to execute for a kill in PvP. I feel like it's probably A tier, slightly harder than balance or elemental to be able to pull off, right, as a returning player, mechanically demanding than elemental or balance. So I'll throw it up on the A tier. We got to give the mages a little bit of credit here. When it comes to actually being able to pull off a victory or a successful moment, I think that those are a little bit more demanding than the balance or the elemental, which are kind of just bouncing around, keeping dots up, having a good time. So, okay, A tier for the fire mage. Frost mage, God, we had to get 2 mages in a row, didn't we? Why did we have to get 2 mages in a row? It's the same deal. Maybe it's slightly easier. I feel like Frost is a spec that you can get away with just in PvP, just playing defensively, casting out frost bolts, blizzards, slowing targets, and avoiding the game, and still pull off wins with that strategy, especially if you're playing with another spellcaster in PvP. In PvE, I mean, just throwing Frozen Orb, Blizzard down, pressing Ice Lance. I still think it's pretty like just pick up and go. It's pretty intuitive. You've got low cooldown counterspell again, so that does leave it there. But I think you can get away. I think you can get away with it a little bit more. I think that it's a little bit easier to jump into right away than Fire is in PvP. And then Arcane in PvE. This is why it's so hard to incorporate everything in the game, but I just wanted to give you my opinion of it. I think Frost is a little bit easier, less of a steep curve because you can focus in PvP on just defense, avoiding targets, slowing them, and doing damage and pull off victories like that. I think it makes it a little bit less challenging than Fire or Arcane. And then in PvE, I think it is kind of similar. Just build icicles, spend them with Ice Lance, keep AoE on the ground with Frozen Orb and Blizzard on as many targets as you can. I don't think that, and if you get Flurry procs versus Flurry, I don't think that it's as complicated. I would say that it's a little bit easier as a newcomer to pick up and less mechanically demanding overall in the game. So it's going to go in the middle tier. On the B tier, Marksmanship Hunter, I can just put that right away with Destruction. I feel like it's the same kind of lock and load play style, unironically, as it's Marksmanship Hunter, where you're just kind of casting. You can't be interrupted like Beast Mastery, but you can be line of sighted in PvP, which can be challenging. You're going to be limited on your cleave when there's only 2 targets in PvE. Spending your aim shot charges is pretty straightforward, much like BM, but I think the stationary nature of it is what makes it a bit more challenging. BM Hunter just because everything on the move all of the time. It's damage coming from its pet mostly, whereas damage from Marksman is coming from you. So I think it does make it a bit more mechanically demanding than Beast Mastery specifically, but not by much. I think it's a spec that you could pick up and have success with. Land trap out of stuns every 30 seconds in PvP and line up big burst damage that can't be interrupted. So I think that makes it a fairly easier specialization to get into. There are tons of things you could do on the top end with it, but its initial base requirement of its mechanics I think are much lower, so I'm putting it onto the C tier. Again, this is personal opinion. I've gathered this data from studying World of Warcraft as a commentator for I don't even know how many years now, 7 years, watching creators, streams. So I'm doing my best to give this as an unbiased opinion, because the main purpose of this list is to be useful to you if you want to make a selection and a spec that's going to be really mechanically demanding, have a high end where you're really pushing for it throughout the expansion, taking into account also whether or not a spec's going to be really bad and just letting you know, right? Which is why it's good to listen to the video, not just skip right to the end, because you might see Demonology on S tier and then go after it without hearing what I've said about Demonology. But that is the main purpose of the video. And finally, we've got Shadow. Now, Shadow, much like Balanced Druid, its crowd control is more or less predetermined in PvP. It goes on the enemy healer. Unless there isn't a healer, then it goes somewhere else. But if there's a healer, almost 99% of the time, any crowd control you have is going on that target. So you don't really have to think about it. You can situationally mix it up, and it does have that top end, but you're more of like a rinse repeat when it comes to your crowd control. You have spammable mind control though, and that definitely redeems it in terms of whether or not it should be on the top end of the list here, because mind control is much like a polymorph or a cyclone effect, where you can remove damage. You can also kill targets that are dotted up at low health, really high skill cap on that. It's got team utility. Cooldown management is very important with this specialization. However, with the rework, while I think it was really well done, it has made the spec more newcomer friendly, by allowing you to cast your dots instantly and then instantly cast your dots onto another target, which was one of the biggest barriers to this spec in the past, was that, oh no, I'm being attacked, I can't do any damage because I'm going to get interrupted. You can kind of get over that hurdle now, whereas you wouldn't have in the past, which I think makes it a little bit more newcomer friendly. But its toolkit is just so deep and vast, where you have so many different options in what you can do and what you can get done, that I think it deserves a more complicated position. It's so hard to say. It doesn't have that low cooldown interrupt, but you have mind control and you need to mass dispel in PvP specifically. In PvE, maintaining your dots on multiple targets with Searing Nightmare, I think it's a pretty straightforward rotation. It's not very difficult to pull off with Mind Seer and the new AoE talents that have come to the specs. I think in PvE, it is a nice spec to kind of just log in. In PvP, it's also a nice spec to log in and do damage, and thanks to all those new instant dotting talents like Damnation and Unfurling Darkness. So if that's important to you, but it's got a high skill ceiling in PvP, specifically with Mass Dispel, removing crowd control, removing enemy immunities. This is why this list is so hard. This is why this list is so hard. I don't think it's as mechanically demanding as Affliction or Demonology, because of all of the other things for aforementioned comments, where the damage is easier to do. Its crowd control is a little bit more predictable. I feel like it is harder than Balance and Elemental, because it eventually is cast demanded. And the Mass Dispel utility of it, I think it's probably deserving of A tier in terms of its overall mechanics. You may not be instantly successful on it in PvP specifically. In PvE, I think it's a little bit easier than that, than an A tier. So if you were worried about that overall, I think it would be a little bit lower, a little bit easier to pick up, specifically with a lot of the changes that they've made. And that's going to be the list here. We've constructed it. We did it. We've for some reason, if I had to make a tier list of the tier lists, this was the hardest tier list of the hardest range specs I've had to make, just period. But you know what? It's done. It's out there. And we've made it. So thank you very much for watching. I hope that this video was helpful to you. If it was, please leave it with a like. If you like this type of content, please subscribe, as I am uploading as regularly as possible, or as frequently as possible, to get prepared for Shadowlands. And I'm trying to take every single angle and thought process possible to help provide content that will allow you to make the right decision for yourself when it comes to Shadowlands. And I'm taking into account a ton of things. It's not just, oh, that's the highest DPS, pick that one, or this is the most fun, you should pick that one, or whatever your heart desires. I'm covering every single thing I can possibly think of to help make this selection process a bit better, because it's a pretty important choice to make moving into Shadowlands. Other than that, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.